I never thought of myself as a witch. Sure, I might be a bit eccentric. I live alone in a small house surrounded by a wild garden, wear long dresses, big hats, and a lot of black. I also have a black cat named Poe, who wandered into my garden one day and never left. So I can see why some people might think I'm witchy, but I didn't really mind it until Timothy Baker came knocking at my door. It was a few weeks before Halloween, and I had already decorated. Pumpkins were scattered across the porch, cobwebs hung over the bamboo archway, and a broom leaned against the door, just for fun. I had just pulled a batch of bat-shaped pumpkin cookies from the oven when I heard the knock. I figured it was the mailman or maybe Mrs. Wilford from next door, who promised to come share her pumpkin bar recipe. But when I opened the door, it wasn't either of them. It was a young boy. He looked around 9 or 10 years old with shaggy blonde hair, a hand-me-down outfit that seemed a bit too big for him, and skinned knees. But what really caught my attention was the fear in his eyes. He was trembling. His face was pale, and there was a bruise along his left cheekbone. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the ground, clearly nervous. "Can I help you?" I asked. His voice was shaky as he answered, I'm here to ask for a favor." I wasn't sure what to make of it, but something about his hesitance made me uneasy. He still wouldn't look at me, just stared down at the bag he was holding tightly in his hands. After a long pause, he mumbled, "I read you're supposed to bring an offering when you ask a witch for help." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what I was hearing. He was alone, and whatever this was, it seemed more serious than just a trick-or-treat request. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. He hesitated, but then followed me, still looking like he was ready to bolt at any moment. Once inside, I set out some cookies and milk, trying to ease his nerves. But before I could say anything else, he looked me in the eye and said, "I want you to kill my brother." I froze. The words hung in the air. I wasn't expecting that. "You want me to kill your brother?" I repeated, making sure I heard him correctly. He nodded, but his voice was quiet. "Jake is a bully. He's mean. He hurts me, and he hurts other kids too, and even animals. And I'm really scared that when my little sister is born, he's going to hurt her." I could see how much pain this kid was in. He was clearly terrified. He went on to explain how his parents had ignored the situation. He had tried to tell them about Jake's behavior, but they didn't listen. The worst part was that he was worried his brother would harm his baby sister once she arrived. I didn't know how to respond. My instinct was to send him away, to tell him I couldn't help him with something so dark. But there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the fear in his eyes. After a long pause, I made a decision. "All right, I'll take care of it." I couldn't believe I just said that, but there was something in me that felt it was the only way to help him. Later that night, I was walking through town when I ran into Jake Baker. He was riding his bike, and as soon as he saw me, he called out some cruel taunts, throwing a rock at me and knocking me to the ground. His words stung, but what bothered me more was the anger behind them. Jake was more than just a bully. He was dangerous. I decided I needed to take matters into my own hands. Halloween was just around the corner, and I'd been preparing my yard for the occasion. I had turned my whole property into a spooky graveyard, complete with skeletons, headstones, and zombie hands sticking up out of the ground. My jack-o'-lanterns were set up, glowing eerily in the dark. I didn't expect many trick-or-treaters. Most kids were too scared to come near my house. But that night, Jake came by, and I could hear him smashing pumpkins and causing trouble. He wasn't trying to be quiet. He wanted attention. He even knocked over my candy bucket, and when I heard him crash through my yard, I knew it was time. I waited for a few minutes before stepping outside, flashlight in hand. When I reached the edge of the yard, I shined the light into the hole I had dug earlier, a hole I had prepared just for this moment. There, lying in the hole, was Jake. He had fallen on one of the wooden stakes I had planted, and the blood was pouring out of him. He was still alive, but barely. His body was twitching, struggling for breath. I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. He deserved this. He had terrorized this town for too long, and now he was paying the price. I stood there for a moment, watching him fight for his life before I started shoveling dirt into the hole. It didn't take long for him to stop moving. The fight left his body, and the land slowly absorbed him. He was gone. The next year, just before Halloween, Timothy came knocking on my door again. This time, he was different. His smile was brighter, his energy more confident. He handed me a manila envelope, warning me not to open it until he was gone. I didn't question it. We talked for a while, and I learned his baby sister Allison was doing great. She was about to turn 1. When he left, I opened the envelope to find a small, handmade ornament, a clay jack-o'-lantern. It was his way of thanking me, though he never spoke the words. I couldn't help but wonder how much he knew, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that his sister was safe, and he had finally found peace. As I finished decorating my pumpkins for Halloween that year, I thought about how much had changed. The kids in town no longer feared me. They had started to view me as a good witch, and they even came by to play in my yard. But one thing would always remain the same. I had my secrets. I hung the little ornament by my window, watching the pumpkins glow in the dark. Halloween was approaching, and everything had to be perfect. It was my favorite time of year. Happy Halloween. Okay, so I have never been much of a Reddit guy, but have recently gotten on it out of interest of these isolated staircases found 30 or 40 miles in the woods. You know how it goes, a few hours pass, and I find myself here. Anyways, I grew up in a military family, probably why I currently serve, and have heard endless stories about combat, barracks, shenanigans, and things of that sort, so I never paid a whole lot of attention. One night my uncle told me a story I'd have a hard time forgetting. I realized this was because you never hear of ghost stories in the military, so here it goes. One night around 3 a.m., an MP sits alone at one of the back gates of a small National Guard post in Mississippi. It was cold outside, so he sat inside of his guard box with a small space heater and a cup of coffee. He would have to radio in every hour or so in order to let his command know that he was okay and nothing had occurred throughout the night. As he sat alone reading a book, he heard a small wail coming from a few hundred yards up the gravel road he was posted at. It was too dark to see that far, so he left the inside of his guard box to get a better look. At this point, he was startled because the scream sounded like something out of a horror film, deep and sorrowful. To his surprise, after staring into the darkness for a moment, a young woman appears. She was covered in blood and limping down the road. Still distraught and screaming, she makes her way closer and closer to him. At this point, the soldier takes off in her direction in order to provide her any medical aid he could. Once they meet, she starts screaming that she had a wreck a ways up the road and her child was in the car. She begged him to go save my child. Realizing how cold it was, he wrapped his fleece jacket around her bloody body, covering it in blood. He placed her back in the guard box and took off in a sprint down the road. He arrived to find a car flipped upside down and a small child unharmed and crying in the back. Once he removed the child and laid him on the road, he went to check if anyone else was in the car. When he arrived back at the car, he couldn't believe what he saw. The woman from before, bloody and dead in the front seat, still strapped in. He removed her from the car and checked her pulse. She was gone. He grabbed the child and hurried back to the guard box in order to radio up to his unit. Upon his arrival, he finds his fleece jacket laying on the ground outside the box without a trace of blood on it. Hope y'all enjoyed this. It definitely gave me some chills when I heard it. People always associate ghosts with evil and negativity, but in this case, it just seemed like the mom's unfinished business was simply to save her child and had no need to roam the earth once that was finished. I'm not much of a writer, but this is the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, and I need to get it off my chest. This is a true story. A lot of the details have been altered for confidentiality, but the essence of it is real, and I've wanted to share it for a long time. I've been a social worker for 5 years, specializing in psychological trauma. Throughout my career, I've worked with many children, most of whom face some form of trauma, but nothing compares to the case I'm about to tell you. I had been referred to work with a 13-year-old boy. Let's call him Chris. He'd been exhibiting behavioral issues at school, testing boundaries, making others uncomfortable, and having a series of fleeting friendships that would always end in manipulation. His behavior seemed like it might stem from trauma, so I was assigned to assess the situation. When I first met Chris, something felt off. His family seemed completely normal on the surface. Upper middle class, supportive parents, and two younger brothers. But there was a strange vibe, especially from Chris. He didn't smile. He was polite enough, but it didn't feel right. There was something in the air I couldn't quite explain. Over the first few sessions, Chris constantly tested my boundaries. He'd ask personal questions, probing into my life as though he were fishing for information, trying to get under my skin. At first, I assumed it was just normal curiosity for a kid that age, but his intent felt different, more calculated. I was good at setting boundaries, and he quickly realized that I wasn't someone he could manipulate easily. The first warning sign that something was seriously wrong came when Chris mentioned he liked dogs and longed for unconditional love. That seemed innocent enough until he started describing his feelings about cats. He said he hated them and had kicked a neighbor's cat because it was annoying him. When I pressed him, he casually mentioned that the cat had run away, and his tone suggested he felt no remorse. This was when the red flags really started to pile up. Despite this, I continued working with him, hoping that the right intervention might help. But things only seemed to get worse. Chris was becoming more manipulative, and his family was falling apart. His father was emotionally distant, working long hours to avoid being around Chris. His mother, despite being the one who spent the most time with him, was becoming more and more of a nervous wreck. His younger brothers, Mark and James, avoided him, though they never gave a clear reason why. One day while I was visiting, Chris showed me a snow fort he'd built in his backyard. It was an elaborate structure with multiple rooms, but when I entered one of the rooms, I found something that chilled me to the bone: animal bones embedded in the snow. At first, I thought it was a normal curiosity for a 13-year-old, but then I realized that one of the skulls wasn't from a squirrel, as he had claimed. It was a cat's skull. As weeks went by, I felt increasingly drained by the case. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. And then one night, I got a phone call that would change everything. Chris's father called me and said, "We need you to come over right now. We discovered something." When I arrived, the family was visibly shaken. Chris looked scared, which was something I had never seen before. After some prodding, they confessed what had been happening. Chris had been sexually abusing one of his younger brothers. It was a horrifying revelation, and one I completely missed despite all my years of experience working with abused children. I felt sick to my stomach. How had I not seen this? After a phone call to Child Protective Services, I thought the situation would finally be addressed, but shockingly, they closed the case. They claimed it was a misunderstanding, brushing off the seriousness of the situation. I was devastated. I didn't know what had happened behind closed doors, but I suspected that Chris had downplayed the situation to make it seem less severe. Whatever had been said to the caseworker, it had worked. Despite the system failing, I didn't give up. Over the following months, Chris began to open up to me more. He was still manipulative, but now he had become more subdued, more cautious. I was able to teach him some skills for better relationships and helped him recognize that his behavior was harming him. Slowly, Chris seemed to change. He began to form some genuine connections with others, and his siblings started to feel safer. Eventually, the family moved to a new house, outside of my jurisdiction. I was glad to see them go, but I never forgot the case. Chris had shown some improvement, but I knew there were still cracks beneath the surface. Years later, I got a message from the mother, out of the blue. It was a simple text: "We need help." I started typing a response, trying to point them toward local services. But before I could send it, she typed back, "Please, I beg you, come over right now. We need help." I called, but her phone went straight to voicemail. The situation seemed urgent, so I contacted the police, and they went to the house immediately. Hours later, they called me in to help with the investigation. When I arrived, the house was empty. Everything of value had been taken, and it looked as if they had left in a hurry. It was clear something was wrong, but I couldn't understand what had happened. Now, weeks later, the police still haven't been able to locate them, and no one knows where they've gone. I haven't heard from the family or anyone else involved. All I know is that Chris was a true sociopath, someone who was manipulative, cruel, and dangerous. I don't believe in ghosts or demons, but people like Chris walk among us, and most of the time, we never even know it. I'll never forget this case. It stays with me, haunting my every thought.